bring a group of like-minded, passionate people all coming together to do really cool things together. And that's where the problem actually starts in that classic definition of what an organization is. It's a collective of like-minded, passionate people.
Hello, listeners, viewers. Have a very special episode for you today with another episode of Test Optimize and Scale. Have Thomas Thomison in the house, co-founder of HolacracyOne, also a partner at Encode and PowerShift. Going to be going deep into the current ecosystem of PowerShift as well as the world of blockchain. Thomas, thanks for taking the time to join the
Yeah.
podcast today.
Thank you so much, Jason. I'm really happy to be here and have a conversation.
Absolutely. Had a lot of fun with you on a recent panel and thought listeners, viewers would get a lot out of the discussions. Want to familiarize the audience a bit with yourself and thought we could begin with your story and what led you into the world of blockchain.
Yeah, that was a fun conference. Boris Pikolov from Stillbox put us
Yes.
together. That was a really cool deal. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to hang out. And the story for me is pretty classic in some sense. I mean, I started out as an entrepreneur. I've always had the entrepreneurial itch way back in the day, and had a fairly typical conventional trajectory. I just started my first businesses in my 20s and then started to work for big companies and small companies and public companies and Fortune 5 companies, really immersing myself in the whole world of business. That kind of led me into the whole management consultancy thing and advisory services thing, and kept kind of growing my experience as a conventional leader, conventional entrepreneur. And over the years, working with all the usual names, the usual suspects of McKinsey and Price and Accenture and others, helping big organizations and medium-sized organizations try to improve organizational life and operational effectiveness and performance and all of that. I kept running into the same scenario. And it was, we would try all these clever techniques. We would try implementing all these interesting change initiatives from agile to lean to team building exercises, employee engagement, decentralized functional structures. And over again, the promise of these really clever and actually valuable techniques would be lost when they went right back into the same system that caused the problem in the first place. In other words, we were addressing superficial problems, expecting deep fundamental change. And it was like we did this over and over again. And I don't know about you or your audience if they've been exposed to this, but in the change management and management consultancy world, there's this notion that every change cycle has about an 18-month life cycle. If we can just hang on and get to the end of it,
Sure.
we'll be right back where we started from 18 months later. And this is just crazy making, at least it was for me. Anyway, I did this. I started a few companies and launched a few entrepreneurial projects. And then I just kind of got fed up. I actually got a little cynical. It was like, wow, I've tried everything under the sun. I've had most things under the sun tried on me. And we end up kind of right back in the same place. And so, right around the early 2000s, 2005 and six, I was kind of cynical about the whole business world and was starting to be able to think about organizations differently and be ready to really change my whole paradigm on how humans come together to coordinate work to get really cool stuff done in the world. And I crossed paths with another person that was also exploring and running some experiments in his software company, a guy by the name of Brian Robertson. And he and I crossed paths at a random conference sometime in New York in like 2006. And he was experimenting in the decentralization space, the self management and self organization space, and really running experiments on what could we do to fundamentally shift the power structure and the power dynamics of organizations to really effectively swap out one power system for another. And this was intriguing. So we met in 2006, launched a company called HolacracyOne in 2007. And Holacracy became a leading management hierarchy replacement practice. So it's a set of rules. Think algorithms, think smart contracts because I'm going to go there. But it was a set of written down rules that bound everybody to the same gameplay to bake in business fundamentals and best practices around all the operational techniques that we talked about, good operational practices, and decision making governance practices. So it was a complete top down replacement, bottom up replacement for management hierarchy. It swapped out the pyramid and a personal power hierarchy for something else, a functional holarchy, a whole part organizational structure that pursued not a leader's purpose or vision, but the organization's purpose, and changed how decision making got made and how authority got distributed and how work got structured. So I got a front row seat back in 2007 and 8 to the whole self-organization, self-management, decentralized organization movement before it became a DAO thing, and we'll probably get there too.
Yep.
But a lot of leading entrepreneurs had the exact same experience. Some household name entrepreneurs I got the pleasure of working with who experienced the frustration that I had felt in my own journey and was ready to look for alternatives because they were tired of status quo structures. So my whole journey in this space began around 2007 with Holacracy as a complete wholesale replacement for management hierarchy. And I mean actually every word of that. There are no bosses, there are no supervisors, there are no CEOs, there's no managers managing people. Everybody has the ability to serve a function, a role, or many roles. There's no single job description or position description written by somebody that doesn't actually do the work. Governance is an internal and decentralized thing. And it just goes on and on and on. So we've been doing that actually for 15 years, and HolacracyOne has a global footprint. We have thousands of companies, tens of thousands of people, book published software to support the whole practice. Now they're competing software tools, which is great because the market's growing. And that led me to be exposed to thinking about decentralized systems. And so that was kind of the entree to me. It was my entree into decentralized structures and decentralized currencies ultimately was right around that time, 2012, 2013. And that was when blockchain began to kind of emerge from the shadows and the early adopters to some of the other just after the early adopters, and that would be me. So I took my first foray into cryptos and Bitcoin and all the things that were coming around 2012, 2013, and started to do a deeper dive in the blockchain itself, decentralized structures. And many things were being decentralized. It wasn't just currency, but the blockchain and the blockchain thinking, the distributed ledger kind of thinking was beginning to fundamentally shift a lot of things. And so that led me on another path that I can certainly talk about, we can talk about together. But that was kind of the entree into the world of decentralization and the world of cryptocurrencies, now the world of smart contracts, of course, and what we call DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. I'm happy to talk about any of those things.
Absolutely. And so much to work off of there. And I think that's what's so radically different about your story than the many other even Web3 decentralized experts that have been on the podcast. So going back to the world of management consulting, working with the big names, but getting frustrated, even getting cynical because you're seeing this 18-month cycle that keeps occurring. You're able to meet Brian Robertson. You guys create Holacracy '07, and all around turning the management hierarchy upside down, I'll say. And whether
Yeah,
we're talking about operations, whether we're talking about governance, actual decision making, less about the individual, I should say nothing about the individual, and all about the
exactly
entity.
right. Spot
Yes.
on.
And we are our own worst enemy in so many cases. I've seen it with ego and leaders early in my career. Have seen people at the wheel, for lack of a better word, make mistakes, fail in so many different situations. So I could see the long-term utility of having this infrastructure. Have questions on how you're able to accomplish it because I've seen standard
Sure.
operating procedures, SOPs fail. So I look forward to getting
Hmm.
into more detail with it with you here. But just wanted to point out that this is outstanding in comparison to other management structures. What were some of the initial formats you used to accomplish this? What were some of the pitfalls, and how have you guys been able to grow and improve the systems since?
Yeah, just in terms of replacing management hierarchy, or what we would call a status quo, how you get work done is you bring a group of like-minded, passionate people all coming together to do really cool things together. And that's where the problem actually starts, in that classic definition of what an organization is. It's a collective of like-minded, passionate people, which means that we have to use relational tools to align incentives and values and work. And then we have some operational practices. Those bolt on things actually do improve things, but they're resting upon a power structure that has been dependent on personal power and personal development and good ego strength. And we rely on these relational issues, and that's where a lot of the problems begin, because all of those those rules are implicit, they're not explicit. So one of the things that Holacracy really brought to the table was making a distinction. That an organization is not a collection of people, but it is a collection of functions or processes. It's a structure designed to express organizational work. And what happens in the organization, by that definition, is always about the work. And if everybody's playing by the same set of rules, this process has a constitution, a rule set. That rule set explains how to process anything that is unclear into clarity, how to figure out what the work is together as a group that's doing the work, and assign that work with clarity to roles and accountabilities and expectations, and hold each other to meeting those expectations over time. And when the market shifts or changes, instead of having 5-year plans and predicting and controlling a future that we can never predict or control, we're really bad at that, is to be in a dynamic process of always deciding, always experimenting, always scaling based on what's actually happening in reality. So the optimize and scale part is built in because it's a really good practice. You experiment and adapt. And the faster you can do that in smaller increments, the better you get. And if you can do that without having to try to be a friend with somebody or encourage somebody, and I mean that kind of tongue in cheek and kind of not. If we're all together for the purpose of the organization, and that's what inspires us to get out of bed in the morning, is to see this really cool thing show up in the world. And that's what we want to contribute our time, energy, and talent towards, not necessarily having a good bonding experience with another person. Now, that bonding is important, don't get me wrong. And this is a big misnomer. People hear this separation of people and the organization, and they think, how cold, how
Mm.
callous, this must be a nightmare. And what actually happens is exactly the opposite. Because when we have a healthy set of rules to organize the work operationally, it allows us individuals to have a different set of rules to relate personally. And we don't mix the two. So we're not trying to use business structures to improve relationships. We use the best practices around good relational practices to deepen and improve relationships, not business practices. We use business practices to get operational work done. And so this is one of the key distinctions holacracy makes, sometimes said colloquially as the separation of role, the work, and soul, the human. With those two things separate and teased apart, we can treat and honor them equally, but differently.
So different than the business world I was brought into, and
Yeah, me
you
too.
entered. Yes.
Yeah, I spent 30 years doing it the old way until I just couldn't do it anymore.
And the concept of decentralization has some overlaps with this, but you're taking it to the next levels, where you're saying, hey, it's all about the rule set, it's all about the expectations. As individuals, we're part of this organization, but for its purpose. Now we can still
Yeah.
have relationships with the other people involved, but there's a rule set around that. We've found that actually by doing so, we're able to strengthen those relationships because we're able to separate what is a business decision, what is for the growth and sustainability of this organization, and what is for our own personal initiatives, which we're not downplaying, we're just separating them. And it's clear, watch any business television show or read any book
Hmm.
on how to be successful in any vertical, and relationships are going to be a part of that. And thinking about some of these situations, they're not really necessary for the growth of the organization, and they're often to appease things, for the individual, not for the
They are.
larger company, and to even placate emotions for future decisions. So if you're operating off a rule set with the goals in mind, in theory, you're setting yourself up for larger accomplishments, and you are talking about the pace, the frequency, maybe in
Yep.
a more accelerated fashion.
Yeah, well said. That is exactly what happens, and that was one of the early draws to these well-known entrepreneurs that I was telling you about. These are successful entrepreneurs that know the laser-like focus you have to have on the work, and you have to pay attention to the details, and you have to hold people in that system accountable.
For
And they were
sure.
seeing, oh my God, this is a way of, instead of begging for or seducing people into being engaged, you have a set of rules that actually allow everyone to sense into how can they contribute to purpose without having to report to a boss, right? So this allows everybody to be naturally engaged and held accountable for the roles, and that's plural. You're not just in a
Mm,
job position in a box on an org chart with dotted lines and matrices. You're in very clear, explicit roles with very clear accountabilities to deliver on the purpose of that role. This is the other thing. In most organizations, there's the mission or the vision right at the top. And it just has less and less applicability the farther down the chain you go. But in practices like holacracy, and this is a nod back towards decentralization, everything in this organizational practice is decentralized. Purpose is decentralized. There's a broad purpose, then there's a functional purpose next layer down, next layer in. Actually, there's no top or bottom, there's no down. And then right to the role specific to the actual work. There's purpose distributed all the way through. So instead of a hierarchy of power held personally, you actually have a holarchy, a whole part structure of purpose. And so purpose is decentralized. Leadership is decentralized. Everybody has the authority to lead their work. They don't need to ask permission from others to lead work. They have clear delegated or distributed authority. So this is fascinating because it was coming on at the very same time that the blockchain was decentralizing many other things. And there was a very interesting overlap. And that led me into really beginning to leverage blockchain technology as a way of supporting these decentralized systems in the organization space. So just like we were contemplating decentralizing currency, I've been working on for the last many years decentralizing organizational work.
Can you give us an example? Hearing rule set, hearing, the leadership and the hierarchy contrasts. I feel like I'm absorbing part of it. I want to add some more clarity for the audience.
Yeah, so there's a little mantra of mine that helps, and this was part of my own learning, right? So I had to unlearn a lot. It's one of the key moves is the willingness to unlearn what you thought was healthy in a kind of pathological system, and you have to kind of give that up to
Yeah.
adopt new healthy behaviors that at first seem like you got to be out of your mind, right? And so the way this works is through simply, it's a simple process. We come together and decide as a local group what is the work necessary to pursue our purpose in our functional group, and where does that work live? We continuously break down the work needed to pursue the work that's in the present. So we don't try to predict what's coming out in the future. We stay very present to what's actually happening now. We pay attention to current reality, as we sometimes say, or current market conditions, as it's more commonly held. And we unpack the work together in functional units called roles, not jobs or position
Mm.
descriptions. But we have multiple roles serving multiple functions to get the work needed to pursue the purpose of that group, or circle is the structure, the organizational structure. So we're all collectively and actively unpacking the purpose into the work needed to express it. And that happens across everyone. So all functional groups across the organization are practicing the same decision-making process, the same operational process. So we've had organizations, even subsidiaries of public companies with multiple thousands, 1,600, 1,700 employees convert to this. And it is like a massive organic structure that begins to go. You have this organizational system that is contracting and expanding based on individuals making decisions about what is the work and where does it live, and then measuring that work, right? And then scaling that work to meet market conditions or demands or objectives or customer needs or so on. And everybody is actively involved in structuring. Structuring does not come from the outside or the top, it comes from the inside out. Everybody is practicing together to sense in locally what's needed at the local level by the people actually doing the work. For a lot of business folks, that should sound very familiar. You want that, right? So you want local activity closest to the work, structuring the work, and then that scales in this new organic structure. And it becomes a really fascinating effort to see unfold because it's dynamically responding to market conditions or constraints or resource allocations or whatever to meet the needs. It is self-balancing in a lot of ways, self-regulating in a lot of ways, and we're not depending on single points of failure or constraints with leaders kind of heroically having to carry the day to make all these complex decisions. That's another motivation. It's really hard running large organizations today, global organizations that are amazingly complex, and yet they still roll up to a pyramid. And that is exhausting for leaders. And they recognize the limits that no one human being can possibly hold the complexity, that it's much better to decentralize that. Much more, you get much more resilience when you have everybody at every level of scale participating in the same decision-making processes and the same operational processes. You get a much more resilient organization.
So by decentralizing the roles that would typically be associated with, let's say, a chief executive officer at the top of the pyramid, you're able to bring in the local perspectives. You're able to separate, what work needs to be done, where it's going to live, and redistribute some of those roles accordingly. But taking into account the thought processes, the thought processes from uh, all different roles that are currently operating.
Yeah, that's 100% true and well said. It allows, not only allows, but the rules say everybody participates. In other words, you
Mm.
can't play a victim in this. You can't demur to the background. You can't blame others because you have authority in your role, as do others having authority in their role. And so it liberates a lot of energy that is locked up in most organizations who are worried about the relationships and leadership styles, because leadership styles are mostly implicit, and you have bosses that have good days and bad days. And this is just crazy making. We have a much clearer, much more structured way, a fair way in a lot of senses for people coming together to get work done. And this is a broader movement. So holacracy is just one flavor, but this has been ongoing for many, many years, decades actually. Leading progressive entrepreneurs recognize the limits of status quo management hierarchy structures, have been experimenting for well over 30 years. And there are great case studies, Harvard Business Reviews, books written, um, well recognized large companies who've been successful in self management and self organization. So this is a thing in the world. There are different flavors. Holacracy is one flavor. Sociocracy is another flavor. Some of your viewers might be familiar with. Frederick, Frederick Laloux wrote a seminal book called Reinventing Organization that documented the developmental trajectory of organizations from very conventional power holders to this new decentralized distributed structure. And so there are millions of people who are now working differently, and millions more hungry to change the way we think about getting work done. So this has become a large space over the last 15, 16 years. And holacracy is just one flavor. And it only addressed, by design, the operational aspect of organization life. And this is the one thing that led me to actually, after about 7 years, say, the entrepreneur that I am is like, okay, cool. We kind of addressed one power structure in organizational life, um, but we haven't addressed where power also lives in organizations, in the legal and capital structures, with boards, officers, directors, and shareholders, and voting rights and personal power wielding in those environments. And with systems like holacracy that eliminate the need for leaders leading people, managers, and bosses, what the heck are we still doing with this old school construct called employee? We're surrendering our power to labor laws and HR departments that are outside of our control. So around 2014 and 15, I was sensing into, okay, what if we took these same principles and applied them to the legal capital structures and the labor structures? And I launched another company, Encode.org, in 2015 to do just that. So in 2015, we started to push the boundaries of decentralization and distributed authority to what I would call the endpoints, the legal and capital structures, rewriting the operating agreements or the bylaws of legal entity types to fully embrace this power shift, this decentralization down to the legal level. This has big implications in the DAO space, in the decentralized autonomous organization space. And then changing the way humans, us individuals, show up in relationship to our work, not as employees, but as actually legally full on member partners, able to participate in a completely decentralized legal structure. And so Encode created this for purpose thing. It called a for purpose enterprise. And it's been doing that in different jurisdictions all over the world. So we have a legal entity type here in the US that has a massively rewritten LLC. Now it's a Wyoming DAO LLC. So we have an operating agreement that fully embraces the Wyoming DAO LLC legislative code and embraces all the things that we've just talked about. Operationally, legally, which means we have financial instruments that can be ported over to blockchain tokens. And we have members who show up more like DAO wallet holders who are just attaching their wallet and participating in the organizations that are known as DAOs. So it's been fascinating, this trajectory, right? So we rewrote the legal code, think the rules, think algorithms, right?
Mhm.
And then those are being ported now out to contracts and chains and tokens. And so there's this interesting trajectory that I got to start playing with in 2015 by doing the kind of the boring work of working with legal agreements and operating agreements, but making them compatible to what was happening in the broader industry. So the for purpose enterprise is now a building block upon which we've created a bunch of other things.
So the for purpose enterprise, working off what you've built with Encode, which allows for the labor laws, the HR, the operating agreements, all to be working off these systems, these set of rules. You've been implementing them into DAOs and being and seeing success in those organizations. And how does this all merge with the world of blockchain, decentralized currencies? I imagine the light bulb went off when you're 15 years deep. At this point, more 7 years deep. 2015 comes
Mhm.
along.
Yeah.
You had already seen what was possible in 2012, but as adoption started picking up and more mainstream coverage, have things moved slower than you had anticipated? Do you picture more of 2025, 2030, these to be the standard operating perspectives for organizations, the decentralized currencies to be looked at as more of the primary? What has been your experience watching this merge with the world of blockchain, looking at
Mhm.
adoption and determining where the future is going?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has been actually much slower, but much more dependent on the uptake curve, the capacity of individuals to make these fundamental changes.
Mm,
They are so fundamental. They do require you to really reorient to a lot. And there are market drivers for this. So remember, we started the for-purpose enterprise thing in about 2015. That was just after the one of the earlier bubbles that burst in the blockchain space, right? But around 2015, 2016, we started entering into the next bull cycle. There's this huge uptake in interest and DeFi would come later, and we ride these cycles. And I think we've been kind of at the um, at the mercy, really, of the market and these bull and bear cycles, these bubbles and bursts around, is the market ready for moving these rules that we've written, moving these shifts in how we think about getting organizational work to take the next step and anchor them in blockchain technology with smart contracts and tokens. So it wasn't until about 2018 that we were able to begin to launch new companies to embrace the blockchain technologies and the new types of tokens that were emerging. And the first one to come online was part of this ecosystem that we've now created, PowerShift Properties. And it's actually where I met Boris Pikolov and Stobox because I engaged them to help us deploy one of the first security tokens that met Reg D requirements. So we wanted to straddle both the regulatory environment and the emerging environment. So PowerShift Properties deployed a security token to fractionalize ownership of real estate back in 2018, 19. And it was our first entity that fully embraced a security token to raise capital and be fully aligned with everything that we've just talked about, all of this decentralization stuff and distributed authority stuff. So we had continuity with what came before, linking to what was coming next. So we had a smart contract. We were beginning to pitch to investors about the value of de-risking their crypto portfolio on speculative coins, not backed by much of anything except market sentiment, which comes and goes, but by real estate. So it was an asset-backed token. And then we had the next bubble burst. So we went through the 2008, 18-19 cycle, and so we've ridden these waves, and I think that's just the natural way things evolve. The market becomes ready when it's ready, and we've been early in creating these systems and structures and financial instruments to be poised to scale when the market becomes ready again, which it seems to be about maybe maybe about ready to make another shift.
hurry up and wait is what I've
Yeah,
seen on the
exactly.
development side.
Well, hurry up, wait, and survive. The
Mhm.
entrepreneurial mantra. You start these companies a little too early, and they become really challenging to keep them alive and going until you have product market fit. Classic. None of the things I've said, by the way, for the business folks listening, we are not throwing baby out with bathwater. We are completely honoring business fundamentals. We're just integrating them in a new structure. It's like any decentralization model, even the go-to classics of whether you're decentralizing transportation or lodging or whatever, you still have to pay attention to the business basics. Same with launching any companies.
And anyone on the business side, I think, is always seeking out a stronger, more efficient, more effective model. So being able
Yeah.
to embrace those fundamentals also adheres us to the philosophy of we can do better. Our competitors will do it if we are not. And how do we operate as the top of class? How do we take on more market share? How do we build platforms? How do we build organizations and mechanisms that support and impact millions of people positively and allow for the further growth of the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of a yin and yang. You innovate, and then the market kind of doesn't support it, and then the market does, and you innovate more. And this is just how things grow, I think, in the world. And it's evolutionary. It's one step at a time, incremental.
And I know you
Which
guys
is
have been able to
why,
work on.
well,
Oh,
it's why we
what
can't
was it, Thomas?
predict
Yeah,
that predict and control thing.
yeah,
The thing that keeps these kind of organizations alive is they're not living too far in the future financially or organizationally. They're right sized and aligned to what the market will allow. And a founder, owner, or egoic leader doesn't get to project her or his idea into what the organization should be and prop it up. It's a really fascinating thing. It aligns itself with current market conditions, current resource constraints, current demand, and
mm,
it doesn't get sidetracked by founder, owner, ego, propping things up beyond maybe their ability to actually serve a market.
sure. Ego, emotions, fear that
All of
restrain so
it.
many founders. Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Uh, and I know, those next models, next iterations are what drove me to blockchain. First for investor marketing, different types of crowd sales and efficiencies, and what that means for long-term liquidity. So I know I'm always seeking out the next best system. It's so amazing to me. You guys have been doing this and on this path since 2007, and how it's hit these different milestones in 2012, 2015, 2018. You were talking about the creation of PowerShift and the PowerShift ecosystem. I know you guys have worked on some landmark projects there, including Polygon and other household names.
Mhm.
Are these companies all following the same ideologies? Have you been able to successfully roll out this line of thinking into groups within the PowerShift ecosystem?
We have, yeah. Thanks for asking. We continue to scale, so it is a scale up of the fundamental building blocks that we created back in 2007 operationally. Then Encode created this for-purpose enterprise, and we started launching other enterprises in different markets, different market segments, like the real estate one I just described. And then what came after that were many others. They weren't designed from a mind, like a prediction of what might be needed. But I would be out speaking at different conferences and talking to other entrepreneurs, and I would get asked, for example, how do you find venture capital, angel investing, scaling capital for these esoteric, exotic structures that you're talking about, Tom? It must be, where do you find investors willing to invest in these, you know, edgy sort of new things that are coming onto the market? And there were not great answers. I mean, I was connected to impact investing and social venture investing and some of the flavors that are in the neighborhood of this, but they weren't fundamentally power shifted. They weren't aligned to rethinking how boards work and how shareholders are treated. So this is a need and a tension in the world that something could be different. The way things are now could be actually different. This is the entrepreneurial mantra, of course. There must be a better way. So it's like, okay, there must be a better way to source and deploy capital for purposeful endeavors that are decentralized. And so this gave rise to PowerShift Capital. And PowerShift Capital is rethinking the whole private equity and venture model. And just this year, this organization started in 2019, and it began to fund some of these new ventures, these for-purpose enterprises. And it's just this year that we've lived into it enough, that we know enough, that we can write the rules to rethink how to source and deploy scaling capital and early stage capital without LPs and GPs,
Mm.
without 220s, without GPs managing other people's money. And for those in the regulatory space, you probably know what I'm pointing to with the Howey test, is that we are not relying on other people to manage investors' money. We have a decentralized distributed system where we're all participating in the sourcing, managing, and deployment of capital in the portfolio. And it allows us to rethink the venture space and deploy a new type of token, not a security token, because we're not representing it as that, but an equity token in a portfolio of companies that the collection of investors are managing together. So we've launched PowerShift Capital as a new way of thinking about raising investment dollars and deploying those investment funds to these types of organizations. So it itself is decentralized. It itself is using a non-security and equity token to represent an ownership stake in this portfolio. And this has been a fascinating experiment. So it is power shifted. And then that story just goes on. We've created other companies as well in different segments to create a whole ecosystem of companies. And then just this year, we put the governing body of the PowerShift ecosystem, as we call it, that's using a utility token to map the value exchanges by and between all of these organizations. So we've just deployed our third token on the Polygon blockchain. Uh, PSTX is the utility token that will be used to make visible the trading of goods and services within the ecosystem. You can think of it the currency of the ecosystem itself, with a marketplace and different incentives and so on. So we've played with three styles of tokens now: a straight up security token with Reg D compliance, an equity token in the PowerShift Capital space, and a true utility token that doesn't try to be an investment vehicle, but actually tries to be a unit of value. One might say, even say, a unit of purpose in an ecosystem. How do you measure purpose? It gets asked all the time. We might have experimented with an answer to that. One answer to that.
So measuring purpose, only way to measure is with numbers. You're looking to, potentially gauge the addressable audience or impact, I'm guessing. But
Yeah.
actively have utility, security, and equity tokens running. You've built decentralized models for PowerShift Capital, where you're deploying these funds using the rule system, not the thoughts of individuals, limited partners, general partners, removing the entire intermediary and seeing stronger results to follow.
Yeah, well said. So that is exactly the experiment we've been running: is what do you do when you can begin to contemplate shifting power structures horizontally across different industries and different segments,
Mhm.
and begin using these tools with different rules. And then the next stage would be, hey, we've written down the rules and we have these new financial instruments for how equity works and profit distribution works in these companies. And we have the rules for the smart contracts. So we can begin to tokenize the financial instruments that are used within the individual enterprises. So this is an ongoing experiment, which is again part of
Yes.
your premise, right? We're always experimenting and adapting, optimizing and scaling, and this just continues on and on and on. This is baked into the rules. It's not an add-on. Back to that bolt-on clever technique. No, it's so important. It's done always by everyone, day to day.
And there's so much alignment in our models in terms of how we're always seeking out better results, variance, optimizing to perform better. Speaking to that, what could listeners, what could viewers look to test and implement into their own model? They're hearing about these decentralized systems, removing people, putting in processes. Are there first steps they can take towards it? Does it require a complete reconstruction of the organization? Are there some things they can begin testing as an entry point?
Yeah, thankfully, there's a good yes answer to that. It was harder in the earlier days. It tended to be an all in affair, which was problematic for sure. But we've been at this now long enough that there are more practices and more tools that align with these principles that I shared with you. One go to, Aaron Dignan is a colleague, friend of mine, entrepreneur, and launched several companies and wrote a book called Brave New Work. And where holacracy is like a fully cooked meal, all the ingredients are included and you have to eat the whole thing when you adopt it. Now you can stage that too. So you can segment your adoption. It's not a, you don't have to eat the whole meal at once, but it is a dish. Holacracy is a dish. Now, Aaron is cooked with the ingredients. So Brave New Work is a really cool entree into all of the practices that larger conventional organizations are experimenting with to get a hint, a flavor, and get a sense of whether this would be an acquired taste in a larger organization or an ongoing concern. So, Brave New Work is a good book. He also has a podcast that talks a lot about how to apply these principles. I mentioned Frederick Laloux, published quite some time ago now, but the Reinventing Organization book is a seminal book talking about the earliest of adopters, again, with some household name entrepreneurs, people who had grown tired with status quo and began experimenting on their own well before there were these formalized rule sets. And these really are the grandfathers of the self-management movement, self-organization movement. So, and there are multiple flavors now out, so folks can pick and choose a flavor that feels right for them. I've mentioned a few of them, like sociocracy, in addition to holacracy, and there are the responsive org is also another flavor. So there's a lot of options now. Is the point?
What about optimization? We're reading, we're implementing, we're even just taking note from some of what you're putting out here, looking at some of these organizations, maybe finding more blueprints online. Uh, Maybe it's not working to the exact level right out of the gate. Maybe it is. And we're just looking to improve. As you had mentioned, optimization's never finished, and you have the group working on it
Exactly.
together.
Yes.
What have been your approaches towards optimization? What are some tips that we could look to implement into our own models?
Yeah, pick a practice or a technique or a process that allows you to break things down into smaller and smaller increments. We tend to think big, big objectives, big projects, big initiatives, and we get stuck. And David Allen is a great example of this. Anybody familiar with the getting things done method? It's a project is a really hard thing to take action on because it's so big. It's a big outcome. But in his work, he gets down to the fundamentals, the essence. What is the next concrete action you can take to put something into the world? Let the world tell you whether that was good or not. It's to be able to take small incremental steps. And I think that's the heart of these systems. It's break it down, break it down, break it down, test it, ship it, express it. Let the reality, let the market tell you how it lands, and then iterate from there. So it's breaking things down into smaller and smaller steps. And this is a deep practice in all of the players that I've mentioned. It's sensing into what's needed now to get you to a next. It's actually giving up a little bit of ego, of thinking big, that you have to have a broader perspective, a context, a scaffolding, a direction, a purpose. You're going somewhere. I'm not saying you're not planning. I'm saying you're actually always planning. You're planning in small increments all the time. You're always processing towards a broader goal, but you're not confusing the broader goal with what's needed now.
Mhm. And I love how you say break it down into smaller increments. Let the data show us what's working. As you said, let the audience, the end users, really dictate where to go next. We all have assumptions going in, but that's probably the ego. There's probably something behind that. As we get down to the last few minutes, Tom, wanted to ask about any examples, any tips towards scale as some final thoughts, and what are the best ways for the audience to get more information, from you on the PowerShift ecosystem, to keep the conversation going? I know I've taken 2 pages of notes here. I'm sure it's a shared feeling.
Yeah, I think natural scaling is what comes to mind for me. Scaling from the inside out to respond to what's back to the now next thing. Oftentimes we scale faster than the market really will allow. We scale faster because we're wanting it so badly. There's this tragic gap of what an entrepreneur or leader can see the future, and that gap of what the organization can actually do. So it's scaling from the inside out, not from the outside in. So that has been my experience over the last 15 years. And these create very resilient structures that are really hard to kill. When you pay attention to aligning yourself with reality, the market, and scaling to meet that. And then as things ebb and flow, back to our boom and bust and our bulls and bears, right? Then you're able to morph and change. And as I said, these things contract and expand. They're not static. And sometimes they end. And this is another thing. I think another misnomer that an organization is a permanent affair. I think the DAOs actually give us a glimpse of this. Projects as purposes coming into being, doing their work, and then dropping off, and then new ones showing up. It's this fluidity, this dynamic process around organizational work that gets really, really interesting. If I look out into the DAO space, that's how we scale. We have a multiplicity of purposes, all running basically the same thing with the same rule set that are explicit, not implicit, that allows for this scale to emerge based on what's needed. I think that's an amazing world that's coming. It may be a decade or more away. I'm not going to predict, but I'm going to live in it and hopefully be there when it arrives.
Well, you've been at the forefront, you've been ahead of the curve. I know I'm taking your word for that and looking at it as a matter of when, not if. And Thomas, you've opened my mind up to so many different processes, philosophies that I want to implement into my own company, my own model. Speaking with you here today, want to thank you so much for your time to coming onto the pod, going in full depth and educating the audience.
My pleasure, man. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was so cool to cross paths as we talked about, and look forward to doing more together.
Absolutely. That feeling is mutual. Want to thank everybody for tuning in as well too. And we definitely look more into Thomas and the PowerShift ecosystem, along with Encode, along with Holacracy. There's so much more there. Thank you again. We'll see everybody next time. Take care.